All right, on to passage 5 of the second practice ACT English test. So this passage is called Why Wolves Howl, and it's basically just a passage about howling, wolves howling, and the social functions that it has. So let's get to the first question. All right. Howling, the sound most often associated with wolves, by themselves performs several blah, blah, blah. Okay. So again, I just say blah, blah, blah because a lot of times with these very short ones, you don't need to read the whole sentence. Well, what's going on here? You have howling, which is the subject, and is there a verb in this sentence? Yeah, the verb is hear, perform. That's the verb. And you basically have a giant modifier here. Is howling the sound associated with wolves? Yes, it is the sound associated with wolves, and sound is singular and howling is singular. So there's really no problem. No change, does make sense. Howling has been wouldn't work because everything is in the present tense, and this is about an ongoing thing that's occurring now. So in this case, this present tense is most appropriate, not present perfect. C, while howling is. The problem with while howling is that you already have a verb perform, right? So if you have while howling is, you would have while howling is, and if you cross out that middle, by themselves perform several key functions within Wolfpacks. You have two verbs, and in addition, because the sentence starts with while, this whole sentence would actually just be the first dependent clause without its own subject and verb. You would basically need something like a comma here with a new subject and a new verb to make this an independent clause, a new complete sentence. So while howling is doesn't work either, and the problem with howling is by itself is just the fact that you would have two verbs in a row, and that one makes sense. So no change is the answer here. What about 62? All right, howling, the sound most often associated with wolves, by themselves perform. Okay, what this test will often do, obviously subject and verb agreement is a big deal, meaning it shows up on every single practice test you'll ever take probably. If you have IR, that's very obviously wrong. It would have to be I am. But what they'll do is they'll separate subject and verb with a lot of junk in the middle. So in this case, the junk is this giant modifier. What you need to keep in mind is that howling is the subject, it's singular, and here themselves is plural and perform is plural. So the way you have to fix this is change this and this both to singular form. So it would have to be howling by itself performs. So is there an answer choice that does that? Sure, H does that. J on itself has a different meaning than by itself. By itself means doing it either alone or it references specifically what it does, what it itself does. On itself is sort of on top of itself. And then you have on themselves perform. You have this, again, the weird preposition on. So F would have to be, or H would have to be the answer in this case. By itself performs. All right, 63. 63, one of these, self-defense, which includes protecting territory. Okay, one of these kinds of things show up a lot where they'll have a relative pronoun, like which, or that, or who, and it'll have a verb there, and it kind of makes you think, well, there's a verb there. So you have a subject and a verb, that's a complete sentence. No. The subject is one of these, self-defense, and this relative pronoun, which basically means all of this stuff, modifies that. Okay? Well, if that's just a big modifier, meaning a big adjective for self-defense, where's the verb? There is no verb. So this sentence needs to be fixed by adding a verb or changing something that does that. The way you would fix this is Let's see. Let's go down the line. A wouldn't work, right? What about B? One of these is. Oh, that could make sense. You could say one of these is self-defense, comma, which includes protecting territory. In that case, you have a subject, one, and then you have the verb is, and then this whole modifier, this whole relative pronoun with the modifying clause, which includes protecting territory, is basically just a big adjective for self-defense. So everything works there. It's a complete sentence and it fixes what's wrong. What about one being? Being is not a verb, it's a verb fragment. It's part of a verb. You could say is being, was being. But again, as I said in prior passages, every time you see the word being or having, those are very unnecessarily worded phrases that you should avoid and almost always are not the answer. And then you have D, one. You change that to just one, comma, self-defense, and all you really do is you get rid of this preposition, but you still have the problem where you have the subject one with no actual verb in the sentence. So one of these is the only one that fixes that problem. So you have subject, verb, and then that's all you need. All right, on to question 64. All right. Packs claim sections of land as private hunting and living spaces and will howl to warn away potential intruders. Those are usually other wolves. The problem that immediately sticks out is that you have a new subject and you have a new verb, meaning you have two separate independent clauses. Basically, that means two separate sentences. And when you have that, you need a comma and some kind of conjunction like the word and, something like that to separate these two independent clauses. In this case, you don't have that. It just keeps going, so it's a run-on sentence. So no change wouldn't be right. G does the exact same thing. It just sticks the word most often in there. So G also has that same problem. New subject, new verb. What about H? Comma and are typically. Well, first of all, if you have a comma, you wouldn't say and are typically, because that comma and the and implies there has to be a new subject and a new verb, but all it does is say are typically, okay? And so there's no new subject, even though the punctuation, the comma with the conjunction, implies that you need a new subject, that, hey, there's going to be a new independent clause here. The other problem is that it's almost sort of confusing. Well, what and are typically other, well, what are typically other wolves? It's like intruders or packs. If you think about it, it's sort of, you can figure out the intruders are probably other wolves, but it's just sort of an ambiguity, meaning it's sort of unclear, and in grammar, everything needs to be as clear as possible. So in this case, the only answer that makes sense is J. Usually, it's obviously very succinct and straight to the point, and it just basically means, it's basically just a description for what kinds of intruders, usually other wolves. And if you were to, you could actually just stick that in the middle of a sentence, like you could say, other intruders, comma, usually other wolves, comma, always fight with blah, blah, blah. It's basically just a modifying, interrupting phrase, and instead of coming in the middle of a sentence, it just comes at the end, okay? What about 65? Which of the following alternatives to the underlined portion would be the least acceptable? Okay, so the trick is you gotta find the one that doesn't match the one that's completely wrong, okay? Not the correct one. So 65, this keep out warning serves as a peacekeeping technique because it helps prevent competing packs from warring over prey. All right, is there anything wrong with because? No, because basically means there's a logical connection between the first part and the second one, where something is occurring in the same vein as something else. So this keep out warning serves as a peacekeeping technique. And why does it do that? Because it helps prevent other packs from fighting with them over, which deer to eat, okay? So because works, and because makes sense. What about B? In that. In that have to do with something occurring along the same veins? Sure, it does. It kind of just describes something more. What about since? Yeah, since does something very similar. Sometimes since is a slightly different meaning than because, but they can have overlapping meanings. Like, I ate bread because I was hungry. I ate bread since I was hungry. What about as? As is also basically a word that just describes, that helps describe something in a similar vein. It's not any kind of contrast. Whereas with a, although is a clear contrast word. It's like however or but. Okay, on the contrary. So a is the only one that would not work. A basically means this keep out, the howling serves as a peacekeeping technique, even though or although it helps prevent blah blah blah. It's saying it's kind of doing this in spite of, which makes the sentence no longer make sense. All right, 66. Wolves also howl to locate and communicate with one another over long distances. Well, is there anything grammatically wrong with this? Nothing grammatically wrong. You have subject, wolves, howl, verb, and then to do what? To locate, communicate, da 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 da, right? And you have this little, I guess, helpful transition word also is also appropriate there. It seems so because here it describes what is one function of howling, right? This is another function. It's not just a peacekeeping technique or self-defense. It's also a way to locate and communicate with each other over long distances. So that really seems to work. F. What about it's also the case that howling is employed? All right. In general, you have this pronoun. Now, this grammatically makes sense. The problem is that if you have it, right, what is it referring to? It's also the case. What is the case? It is it what? There's no clear antecedent. So if you want to be very technical about it, it is wrong. But if you put this in, Microsoft Word, grammar check, or spell check, there would be no problem. It's also the case that, here's the thing. You also have these extra words. Why do you need to say the case? Why can't you just say it directly? And then say that howling is employed? Why can't you just say they howl to do something? Or howling does this? There's no real reason to have all these unnecessary descriptions. So G would be wrong. H, in addition, howling is a way to locate. Well, is anything wrong here? You have in addition, which is pretty much the same thing as also. But if you just say howling is a way, you basically have howling is a way to locate and communicate with one another. Well, who's the one another? If you have wolves here, it's very clear who is the one another, who is communicating with each other. And then howling is also used. Same problem where you basically don't have wolves here, and so when you say, well, who's communicating with each other, that becomes lost in the sentence. Okay? 67. All right, 67. Like their dog descendants, wolves possess intense hearing. Okay, we all know what intense is, like intense, right? But if you're talking about like a sense of smell or a sense of taste or a sense of sight, something like that, intense is not really the right word. Intense more means something like, something taken up to a great amount of effort and a great amount of charge. Hearing, that is more talking about a heightened ability to do something. So A would not work. What about cunning? Cunning has more to do with being clever. So B wouldn't work. Acute can work. That actually describes a sharp, heightened ability to do something, like someone who has acute vision or acute hearing. And then vivid is more directed towards imagery and clear pictures. So D wouldn't work either. So the only word that actually fits is acute. Okay. 68. All right, frequently common activities. Okay, right when you see this, you know what common means and you know what frequently means. Do you really need both? You don't. This is an issue of clear redundancy. So you basically have to find an answer choice that eliminates the redundancy and just makes it, very straightforward. Just whatever one word they choose, just pick that. No change wouldn't work. Quite regularly is like frequently, so this is almost exactly the same. What about many times? Common. That's pretty much the same. Many times is like frequently. What about just common? Yeah, straight to the point. There's no redundancy, no repetition, so J is the answer. All right, moving on to question 69. It says, given that all of the choices are true, which one provides the most logical cause for the action described in the statement immediately following this underlined portion? So this isn't a grammar question. This is about making logical connections and logical deductions about things. So let's read this sentence. Frequently common activities such as hunting for prey often call upon animals' sharp instincts. So this is what we need to look at as something that's possibly could be improved. In order to reunite, the separated wolves howl to one another. So when they're hunting for prey, it seems like they have to separate because it then says they have to reunite, come back together. Well, if they're reuniting, what probably happened when they're hunting or other things? They're probably disuniting or separating, right? So this call upon animals' sharp instincts, is that completely relevant to separating out? Probably not. So A wouldn't be the right answer. What about B? Disperse the pack over large areas of land. Yeah, disperse means for things to separate or spread out. And so this certainly makes sense. What about C? Require the pack to travel some distance. Yeah, that might be true, and it says all of these choices are true, but it doesn't mean that they're separating. They could travel for a good distance altogether. And what about involve the entire pack? Yeah, it can involve the entire pack, but again, it doesn't mean that they're separating. So the only one that most directly fits logically before the in order to reunite is B, disperse the pack over large areas of land. Okay, 70. All right, finally, wolves use howling in the pack's social rituals. Finally, what does finally mean? That means this is the last thing. Is this the last point or body paragraph, the descriptive paragraph about what howling actually does? Yeah, it does, because what's the conclusion? The conclusion is further study of wolves will likely uncover blah, 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 blah. So that finally really was that last part. So there really seems to be no problem with finally. And if we look at the next one, nevertheless, what does nevertheless mean? Well, nevertheless is a sort of contrast word that says, even though this, well, still this, okay? That's not really what this is about. This is about a final point, a new point about what howling does and its function with wolves. So nevertheless isn't any kind of contrast, or nevertheless is a contrast where it doesn't really fit at all. What about second? Well, this is not the second point in the whole passage. So second doesn't work either. And what about thus? Thus means like as a result, as a consequence. But the only reason thus, the only way thus could make sense is if this paragraph or whatever came in this paragraph led to a conclusion this. But is that the case? Is there like because they howl to each other to reunite, therefore they use it in social rituals? No, using it in social rituals seems to be a separate thing, a separate point about one of the functions that howling serves. So, no change would be the only answer choice that makes sense, meaning finally does work. Next one, 71. Okay. This is an issue of parallelism. If you think about math and you look at parallel lines, the lines kind of all go in the same direction. In grammar, that that same thing holds true. If you, especially in particular, if you have lists of things, you want to make sure the structure of that list, it's like I like this and this and this and this. You want to make that structure, the wording of it, all similar for each item. So in this case, you have, upon waking, pack members howl morning greetings while wagging their tails, and then you have they nuzzle each other and engaging in mock fights. Well, what's going on here? You have a list of 3 things, right? And what is this use? This uses the ing form, the participle, to start each item of that list. So what's the odd one out? Wagging and engaging seem fine. They're together. What about they nuzzled? This doesn't work. So how would you change this? You'd have to make this form in the same form as wagging their tails and engaging in mock fights. So let's see which one does that. Well, A doesn't work, but B, you got nuzzling. Nuzzling, wagging, engaging. Ah, that works. Nuzzled and nuzzle don't fit that parallel structure, so neither of those are correct, so B is the correct answer. Alright, on to question 72. When you just look at the answer choices, you can tell this has something to do with modifiers and comma placement, because what's really different about every answer choice is all the commas. So when we read the sentence, it says, usually begun by the alpha or dominant pair of wolves. Alright, well, what's wrong here? You do need commas. The only time you don't need commas when interrupting modifiers is when the modifier is essential to the meaning of the sentence. But in this case, it's not really essential because we know what alpha means, like an alpha male, alpha wolf, alpha dog. And then dominant, that's rough. They're pretty good synonyms. So where should we place these commas? The commas are like parentheses around modifiers that interrupt in the middle of sentences, that are basically, if you removed what was in the middle of those commas, then the sentence could work just fine. So if you have usually begun by the alpha or pair of wolves, does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense, because if you just take out what's in between the commas, the sentence no longer works. Alpha or what? There's no choice. The only way it works is if you put the comma after alpha and you don't have this comma after or. So it would be usually begun by the alpha comma or dominant comma pair of wolves. In this case, you could just read it usually begun by the alpha pair of wolves. So that interrupting modifier is properly, I guess, bounded by commas in the correct places. So what about no change? Would no change work? Well, no, that wouldn't work. What about alpha comma or dominant pair? Sure, that works. What about H? Alpha or dominant pair comma. Why would you have a comma there? You'd have usually begun by the alpha or dominant pair comma of wolves. Well, what comes after pair? Of, right? Of is a preposition. So you don't separate the nouns from the prepositions that modify them. So this would be incorrect as well. And then J just doesn't have any comma here. It just has a random comma after or. So that certainly doesn't work either. 73. So it's usually begun by the alpha or dominant pair of wolves. The pack is excited in preparation for the hunt, partly by chorus howling. Okay, well, you need to obviously look at both pages of your book for this, because you have to see that this first part is usually begun. What's usually begun? The howling, right? The howling is usually begun. But what comes after? The pack comes after. So what this sentence is saying grammatically is the pack is usually begun. Does that make sense? Is the pack begun by the alpha wolves? Maybe it's led by them, but it's not begun by them. So A wouldn't work. B has that same problem. This problem is called a misplaced modifier. It's a modifier, it's placed in the wrong place. B has that same problem. The purpose is not begun. What about excitement? Is the excitement begun? That's not really what the sentence is saying. You can, I guess, sort of begin excitement in some ways, or two people start the excitement, but that's not what the intention of the paragraph is, or that sentence is. The only one that makes sense is chorus howling. Usually begun by the alpha males or the alpha wolves. Chorus howling helps excite the pack in preparation for the hunt. That makes sense, and it grammatically makes sense. So D is the only answer choice that works. And what makes this easy to do is just every single one has a misplaced modifier. It would be more difficult if two of them had properly placed modifiers, and then you had to figure out what the other problem was. 74. The collective sound of wolves howling in various keys also make the pack seem larger. All right, this is that issue of subject-verb agreement separation I talked about. What's the subject here? Sound. What's the verb? Make. Well, this is singular, that's plural, so we have to change that. Makes obviously does that. The sound makes, that works. Are intended to make. The problem is that you have the same are, which is plural even though the noun is singular, and then have, which is also plural. So this is the only one with a singular verb that matches the singular subject. I mean, in addition to that, can't you just say makes or something like that? This is a bit wordy, aren't they? And last but not least, but certainly glad to be finished with this test, right? 75. What's already clear is that the stereotypical image, okay. What is maybe a little confusing is that you could say what is means what is, right? That's a contraction. The verb, however, is here, okay? So what's the subject? That's the subject. It's basically a multi-worded subject. So this is, and then you have all the rest that follows, okay? What's already clear is that the stereotypical image of the lone wolf howling at the full moon obscures the importance howling has in the social life of these animals. So you don't separate the noun or the subject from the verb with commas, you just say it straight through. D obviously just does that straight through. What's clear is, why would you have a comma right after the is? That's like saying Katie is, comma, smart. You just say Katie is smart. So this also is an unnecessary comma. And here, be clear is that this is also unnecessary. This is a relative pronoun, and after that you basically just say whatever you need to say. Okay? The only relative pronoun where you need a comma after before is which, but that's before, it's not even after. And even with which, you just kind of just say it straight through. So that's also unnecessary. So the only answer choice that makes sense at all is D. So that's it for practice test 2, passage 5. You did it, and once you get your mind clear, you can move on to practice test 3.